The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of St. Catherine's Convent, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. Sister Margaret moved quietly through the hallway, her soft footsteps barely making a sound. At 78 years old, she had walked these same corridors thousands of times over the past 43 years. Each day brought the same routine: morning prayers, breakfast with her fellow sisters, teaching duties, and evening reflection. But today felt different somehow. Maybe it was the way the light hit the old piano in the corner of the community room, or perhaps it was the memory that had been haunting her dreams lately. As Sister Margaret passed by the instrument, she couldn't help but pause. The piano sat there like an old friend she hadn't spoken to in decades. This wasn't just any piano. It was a beautiful upright model from the 1940s, with ivory keys that had yellowed with age and a rich mahogany finish that still gleamed despite the years. The convent had received it as a donation long before Sister Margaret arrived, and it had been faithfully serving the community ever since. But mostly it played simple hymns during evening prayers or the occasional birthday song for one of the sisters. Sister Margaret's fingers twitched at her sides as she stared at the keys. Without thinking, her right hand moved slightly, as if pressing invisible keys in the air. Her body remembered what her mind tried so hard to forget. Once upon a time, those same fingers had danced across piano keys with grace and skill that took people's breath away. She had been 22 when she first walked through the doors of St. Catherine's, young, hopeful, and carrying a secret that she thought she would take to her grave. Before her calling to religious life, she had been studying at the city's music conservatory. Her piano teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had called her a prodigy. Concert halls had beckoned. Recording opportunities had been discussed. The world of classical music had seemed ready to embrace her, but something deeper had called to her heart. During her final year at the conservatory, she had felt a strong pull toward service, toward giving her life to something bigger than applause and recognition. The decision hadn't been easy. Her parents had been confused, her music teachers disappointed, and her fellow students shocked. But Sister Margaret knew in her heart that this was her path. When she took her vows, she truly believed she was leaving that world behind forever. The piano, the music, the dreams of concert stages all seemed to belong to someone else, to the person she used to be before she became Sister Margaret. The convent had welcomed her with open arms. She found purpose in teaching the local children, in caring for the elderly sisters, and in the quiet moments of prayer that filled her days. Years passed like pages in a book. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and then 40. She had built a good life here, a meaningful life, but the music never really left her. Late at night, when the convent was silent and her fellow sisters were deep in sleep, Sister Margaret would sometimes hear melodies in her head. Chopin nocturnes would drift through her thoughts. Bach inventions would play in her dreams. Her fingers would move against her blanket, silently playing pieces she hadn't touched in decades. During the day, she would catch herself humming. Not hymns or religious songs, but the classical pieces that had once been as familiar to her as breathing. Sister Catherine, who had been her roommate for 15 years, had noticed but never said anything. She would just smile knowingly when she heard the soft humming coming from Sister Margaret's side of the room. The old piano in the community room became both a comfort and a source of quiet pain. Every day, Sister Margaret would pass by it multiple times. Sometimes she would dust it carefully, running her cloth gently over the keys without pressing them. Other times, she would simply stand there, remembering. The piano had its own stories to tell. Over the years, Sister Margaret had watched as different people tried to play it. There was Sister Anne, who could manage simple hymns but struggled with anything more complex. Young Father Patrick, who visited monthly, could play basic chord progressions but nothing that truly brought the instrument to life. Occasionally, children from the local school would come for visits, and their small hands would pick out simple melodies. But Sister Margaret could hear what the piano was really capable of. When others played, she could sense the instrument's potential, like watching a bird with clipped wings trying to fly. The piano seemed to be waiting, just as she was waiting. Some evenings after the community prayers were finished and the other sisters had retired to their rooms, Sister Margaret would linger in the community room. She would sit in the chair, closest to the piano, close her eyes and let her mind wander back to her younger days. She could almost feel the smooth keys beneath her fingers, could almost hear the rich tones filling the air. Her muscle memory was still there, she was sure of it. Sometimes, when she was folding laundry or preparing vegetables in the kitchen, her fingers would unconsciously move in the patterns of scales and arpeggios. The movements were as natural to her as walking or breathing, but doubt crept in too. 43 years was a long time. What if her fingers had forgotten? What if the skill had faded like an old photograph left in the sun? What if the magic was gone? The other sisters had no idea about her past. It wasn't something she had ever discussed. Her previous life felt like it belonged to someone else, and she had worked hard to become fully present in her religious calling. But as the years passed, especially recently, she found herself wondering more and more about the road not taken. During quiet moments in the chapel, she would pray about it. Was it wrong to miss something from her past life? Was it a lack of faith to sometimes dream about music instead of focusing solely on her spiritual duties? She struggled with these questions, finding no easy answers. The piano continued to call to her day after day. It sat there patiently, like a faithful friend waiting for a conversation that might never come. The keys reflected the afternoon light, and sometimes Sister Margaret could swear she heard whispers of melody floating in the air around it. As another day drew to a close, Sister Margaret made her way past the piano one more time. She paused, as always, and placed her hand gently on the wooden surface. The instrument felt warm beneath her palm, alive somehow. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to sit on the bench, to place her hands on the keys to let the music flow freely once again. But then the moment passed as it always did. Sister Margaret continued on her way, leaving the piano alone in the fading light, both of them keeping their secrets for another day. The news arrived on a Tuesday morning, just as Sister Margaret was finishing her breakfast of toast and tea. Mother Superior stood at the front of the dining hall, her hands clasped behind her back, wearing the expression she reserved for important announcements. "Sisters," she began, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "We have been blessed with an opportunity. The diocese has chosen our convent to host this year's annual benefactor gathering. We will welcome bishops, priests, and generous supporters from across the region." A murmur of excitement rippled through the room. This was indeed an honor. The annual gathering was a significant event, bringing together the most influential members of the Catholic community. It meant recognition for their convent and, more practically, much-needed funds for their various charitable works. Sister Margaret felt her heart skip a beat, though not for the same reasons as her fellow sisters. As Mother Superior continued explaining the details of the upcoming event, an idea began forming in Sister Margaret's mind, an idea that both thrilled and terrified her. Over the next few days, the convent buzzed with preparation. The gardens were trimmed to perfection. The chapel received extra cleaning and the community room was reorganized to accommodate the expected guests. Sister Margaret watched it all with growing anticipation, her secret idea growing stronger each day. The event would include an evening program featuring presentations about the convent's work, testimonials from those they had helped, and a simple, musical performance. This was the moment Sister Margaret had been unconsciously waiting for her entire religious life. 3 days before the gathering, she finally found the courage to approach Mother Superior. The older woman was in her office reviewing the final arrangements when Sister Margaret knocked gently on the door. "Come in, Sister Margaret," Mother Superior called out, not looking up from her papers. "What can I do for you?" Sister Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she stepped into the room. The office was simple but dignified, with a wooden desk, a crucifix on the wall, and shelves lined with religious books and documents. "Mother Superior," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wanted to discuss the musical portion of the evening program." "Ah, yes," Mother Superior replied, finally looking up. "Sister Anne has agreed to play several hymns on the piano, simple, appropriate pieces that will complement our message of humble service." Sister Margaret took a deep breath. I was wondering if perhaps I might contribute something as well. Something that would showcase the beauty of our faith through music. Mother Superior's eyebrows rose slightly. In all her years at the convent, Sister Margaret had never volunteered for any musical performances. What did you have in mind, Sister? I thought perhaps a classical piece, Sister Margaret said, the words rushing out before she could stop them. Something beautiful that would inspire our guests and show them how faith can elevate art to something truly divine. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Mother Superior set down her pen and studied Sister Margaret's face carefully. A classical piece? Sister, are you trained in such music? Sister Margaret nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly. I studied piano. Before I took my vows, I believe I could still manage something appropriate for the occasion. Mother Superior leaned back in her chair, her expression growing more serious. Sister Margaret, I appreciate your desire to contribute, but I must remind you of something important. Our guests are coming to see our devotion to God and our commitment to simple living. They are not here for entertainment or worldly displays. The words hit Sister Margaret like a physical blow, but she pressed on. But surely music can be a form of prayer. The great composers wrote their most beautiful pieces to glorify God. Bach, Mozart, they saw their music as service to the divine. Perhaps, Mother Superior replied firmly, but that is not our way here at St. Catherine's. We have built our reputation on humility and simplicity. Our guests expect to see sisters who have truly left the world behind, not performers seeking to display their talents. Sister Margaret felt her heart sinking. I didn't mean it as a display, Mother Superior. I thought it might be a gift, a way to touch their hearts and open them to generosity. The gift they need from us is the example of our simple devotion, Mother Superior said, her tone becoming more gentle but no less firm. Sister Anne's hymns will serve perfectly. They are humble, appropriate, and in keeping with our mission. I'm sure you understand. Sister Margaret nodded slowly, though every fiber of her being wanted to argue. Of course, Mother Superior. I understand. Good. The older woman smiled. Now, there are still many preparations to be made. Perhaps you could help Sister Catherine with the flower arrangements for the chapel? Sister Margaret left the office feeling as though a door had been slammed shut in her face. The next 3 days passed in a blur of final preparations, but her heart wasn't in any of it. She arranged flowers mechanically, polished already clean surfaces, and smiled when spoken to, but inside she felt hollow. The evening of the event arrived with perfect weather. The guests began arriving just as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the convent grounds. There were indeed bishops in their fine robes, wealthy donors in expensive suits, and local dignitaries who had come to show their support. Sister Margaret helped serve dinner in the dining hall, moving quietly, among the tables with water pitchers and bread baskets. The conversations were lively, filled with discussions of the convent's good works and the difference their donations would make in the community. But as the evening program began in the community room, Sister Margaret felt a familiar ache in her chest. She stood along the wall with the other sisters, watching as Mother Superior welcomed their guests and spoke eloquently about their mission of service. Then came the moment she had been both dreading and anticipating. Mother Superior introduced the musical portion of the evening, and Sister Anne made her way to the piano. The young sister, barely 30, and with only basic musical training, sat down at the bench with visible nervousness. Sister Margaret watched as Sister Anne opened her hymnal and placed it on the music stand. Her hands shook slightly as she positioned them over the keys. The first hymn was Amazing Grace, arranged in the simplest possible way. Sister Anne played it perfectly adequately, but Sister Margaret could hear every missed opportunity, every place where the music could have soared but remained earthbound instead. As Sister Anne moved through her repertoire of simple hymns, Sister Margaret found herself imagining what could have been. She could hear in her mind how Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major would have filled this room, how its gentle beauty would have moved these guests in ways that simple hymns never could. She could picture herself at that piano bench, her fingers, bringing life to melodies that had been silent for far too long. The applause for Sister Anne was polite and warm. The guests seemed pleased with the humble performance, just as Mother Superior had predicted. But Sister Margaret noticed something else. During the music, several guests had been checking their phones or whispering quietly to their companions. The simple hymns, while appropriate, had not captured their full attention. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Sister Margaret remained in the community room, staring at the piano. The instrument seemed to mock her now, its silent keys reflecting the overhead lights like a smile she couldn't share. Later that night, long after the guests had departed and the other sisters had gone to bed, Sister Margaret sat alone in the community room. The piano waited in the darkness, patient as always. She approached it slowly and ran her fingers lightly over the closed keyboard cover. For 43 years, she had successfully buried her musical self. She had convinced herself that this sacrifice was necessary, that her old life had no place in her new calling. But tonight something had shifted. The door that Mother Superior had closed so firmly in her office had not locked properly, and now it was beginning to creak open again. Sister Margaret whispered a quiet prayer in the darkness, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was praying for. Permission? Forgiveness? Or perhaps just the courage to be true to all the gifts that God had given her, not just the ones that seemed appropriate for a nun. The piano waited, as it always did, keeping its own secrets in the silence. 3 days had passed since the evening that changed everything. 3 days since Sister Margaret had watched Sister Anne struggle through those simple hymns, while her own heart ached with unspoken melodies. 3 days of carrying a weight in, her chest that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. The morning started like any other. Sister Margaret woke at 5:30, as she had for 43 years. She dressed in her simple habit, attended morning prayers, and sat through breakfast without really tasting her food. But something was different. There was a restlessness in her spirit that she couldn't shake, a feeling that today would not be like all the other days. As the clock in the community room chimed 2 in the afternoon, Sister Margaret found herself standing in the doorway looking at the piano. It was the quiet hour, the time when most of the sisters retreated to their rooms for meditation and rest. The convent felt peaceful, wrapped in the kind of silence that usually brought her comfort. But today the silence felt different. It felt like it was waiting for something. Sister Margaret stepped into the room, her soft shoes making no sound on the polished floor. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting rectangular patches of light across the room. One beam fell directly on the piano bench, as if highlighting it just for her. Her hands were trembling. At 78 years old, she had thought her days of nervousness were long behind her. But here she was, shaking like a young girl about to perform her first recital. The irony wasn't lost on her that she felt more nervous now, alone in an empty room, than she ever had performing in front of hundreds of people in her youth. She approached the piano slowly, each step feeling like a small act of rebellion. When she reached the bench, she hesitated. This was the moment of no return. Once she sat down, once she placed her hands on those keys, there would be no pretending anymore. No more hiding from the part of herself she had tried so hard to bury. Sister Margaret looked around the empty room one more time, listening carefully for any footsteps in the hallway. The convent remained quiet, peaceful in its afternoon rest. She took a deep breath and slowly lowered herself onto the piano bench. The seat felt strange after so many years. She had forgotten how the height felt just right, how her feet naturally found their position on the floor, how her back automatically straightened into the posture her old teacher had drilled into her decades ago. Mrs. Rodriguez would have been proud to see that Sister Margaret still remembered her lessons about sitting properly at the piano. She lifted the keyboard cover with gentle hands, revealing the keys she had avoided touching for so long. They looked exactly as she remembered them. The white keys, slightly yellowed with age, the black keys smooth and inviting. A few had tiny scratches and marks that told stories of all the other hands that had played this instrument over the years. Sister Margaret's hands hovered over the keys, not quite touching them yet. Her mind raced with worry. What if 43 years had been too long? What if her fingers had forgotten how to move? What if the magic was gone and all she would produce were clumsy amateur sounds that would prove Mother Superior had been right to refuse her request? But then she remembered something her old piano teacher used to say. Music isn't just in your fingers, child. It's in your heart, in your soul. Your hands are just the messengers, and the heart never forgets what it loves. Slowly, almost reverently, Sister Margaret placed her hands on the keys. The touch was gentle at first, barely making contact. The keys felt cool and smooth under her fingertips, familiar despite the decades that had passed. She pressed down on middle C, and the single note rang out pure and clear in the quiet room. The sound hit her like a wave of memory. Suddenly, she was 20 years old again, sitting in the practice rooms at the conservatory, losing herself in hours of music. She could almost smell the old building, hear the sounds of other students practicing in nearby rooms, feel the excitement of discovering a new piece of music. She pressed another key, then another. Simple notes. Just testing. Just remembering. Each sound seemed to unlock another memory, another piece of the person she used to be. Her right hand found a simple melody, something she had learned as a child. Her fingers moved hesitantly at first, but with growing confidence. And then, without fully deciding to do it, she began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The opening notes flowed from her fingers like water, gentle and liquid and absolutely beautiful. Sister Margaret's eyes closed as muscle memory took over, as years of training and practice came flooding back. Her left hand joined her right, adding the supportive bass notes that gave the melody its foundation. It was as if no time had passed at all. Her fingers remembered exactly where to go, exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly when to let a note ring and when to let it fade. The pedals under her feet responded to motions she didn't even consciously think about. Everything was still, there, preserved perfectly in her hands and heart. The music filled the room with a richness that the simple hymns could never achieve. This wasn't just notes being played correctly. This was music being lived, being felt, being poured out from a soul that had kept it locked away for far too long. Each phrase told a story. Each crescendo carried emotion. Each gentle diminuendo whispered secrets that only music could express. As she played, Sister Margaret felt tears running down her cheeks. She hadn't realized she was crying. The tears came from a place deeper than sadness or joy. They came from the relief of finally being whole again, of finding the missing piece of herself that she had thought was lost forever. The Nocturne was a piece she had loved as a young woman. It spoke of longing, of beauty found in quiet moments, of emotions too deep for words. As her fingers moved through the familiar passages, she understood why she had always been drawn to this particular piece. It had been preparing her for this moment, for understanding that some kinds of beauty can only emerge from patience and waiting. The melody soared and dipped, painting pictures in the air that only she could see. She played of moonlight on water, of love found and lost, of dreams deferred but not forgotten. She played of the young woman who had given up her musical career for something she believed was greater, and of the old woman who was finally understanding that perhaps she didn't have to choose between the two. Her technique was still flawless. If anything, the years had added something to her playing that hadn't been there in her youth. There was a depth now, a wisdom that came from having lived, from having sacrificed, from having loved in ways she couldn't have understood at 22. The music carried all of that experience, all of that life, in every note. As the piece neared its end, Sister Margaret played the final phrases with a tenderness that came straight from her heart. The last notes hung in the air like a prayer, beautiful and pure and perfect. When the sound finally faded into silence, she sat perfectly still, her hands still positioned over the keys, hardly daring to breathe. The room felt different now. It felt like something sacred had happened here, something that had needed to happen for a very long time. Sister Margaret opened her eyes and looked around, half expecting to see that the world had changed as much as she felt it had. But the room looked the same. The afternoon sun still streamed through the windows. The convent was still quiet around her. Yet everything felt different because she felt different. For the first time in 43 years, Sister Margaret felt completely like herself. She sat there for several more minutes, absorbing what had just happened. Her fingers tingled with the memory of the keys. Her heart raced with the joy of rediscovering her gift. She had been afraid that the music was gone, but it wasn't. It had been waiting, just as patiently as she had been waiting, for the right moment to emerge. As she finally lifted her hands from the keys and prepared to close the piano, Sister Margaret whispered a quiet thank you to whoever or whatever had given her this moment of grace. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if she would ever play again, but she knew that something fundamental had shifted. The door to her musical self had been opened, and she wasn't sure it could ever be fully closed again. What Sister Margaret didn't know was that her beautiful moment of musical freedom had not gone unnoticed. Just down the hallway, Father Williams had been walking quietly toward the community room to retrieve a book he had left there earlier that morning. The young priest, barely 35, had been visiting the convent for the past week, helping with some administrative matters for the diocese. Father Williams had always been sensitive to music. Before his calling to the priesthood, he had studied music theory and had even considered a career as a music teacher. Though he had chosen a different path, his love for classical music had never faded. He could recognize quality when he heard it, and what was drifting through the hallway was unlike anything he had ever expected to hear in this quiet convent. He stopped dead in his tracks the moment the first notes reached his ears. The sound was so unexpected, so beautiful, that he thought perhaps someone had turned on a radio or a recording. But as he listened more carefully, he could tell this was live music. Someone was actually playing the old piano in the community room, and they were playing it magnificently. Father Williams found himself drawn toward the sound like a moth to a flame. He moved quietly down the hallway, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As he got closer to the community room, the music became clearer, more defined. He recognized the piece immediately, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most beloved pieces in the classical piano repertoire. But this wasn't just someone playing the notes correctly. This was artistry. This was music being channeled through someone who understood it deeply, who felt every phrase and lived every emotion the composer had intended. The playing was technically perfect, but more than that, it was soulful in a way that spoke to something deep in Father Williams's heart. He reached the doorway of the community room and carefully peered inside, not wanting to disturb whoever was creating this magic. What he saw took his breath away completely. There, sitting at the old upright piano with perfect posture and fluid grace, was Sister Margaret. Her eyes were closed, and tears were streaming down her face as her fingers moved across the keys with the confidence of a master pianist. Father Williams had known Sister Margaret for the entire week of his visit. She had served him meals, had shown him around the convent grounds, had been nothing but kind and humble in all their interactions. She was exactly what he expected from a nun, who had dedicated her life to service, quiet, unassuming, devoted to her daily duties. Never in a million years would he have imagined that this gentlewoman possessed such extraordinary musical talent. As he watched her play, Father Williams felt his own eyes filling with tears. There was something profoundly moving about witnessing this moment, the way Sister Margaret seemed to pour her entire soul into the music, the way the old piano seemed to come alive under her touch, the way the afternoon sunlight illuminated both the woman and the instrument as if blessing this hidden gift. The piece was nearing its end, and Father Williams knew he should probably step away, give Sister Margaret her privacy in what was clearly a deeply personal moment. But he found himself unable to move. The music held him captive, and he had to hear it through to its conclusion. When the final notes faded into silence, Father Williams remained frozen in the doorway for several moments. Sister Margaret sat perfectly still at the piano, her hands still positioned over the keys, seeming to absorb what had just happened. The room felt charged with emotion, with the lingering presence of something beautiful and sacred. Finally, Father Williams quietly backed away from the doorway and returned down the hallway, his mind racing. He had witnessed something extraordinary, something that felt almost like a miracle. But he also felt conflicted. Sister Margaret had clearly been playing in private, thinking she was alone. Had he invaded her privacy by listening? Should he pretend he had heard nothing? Back in his small guest room, Father Williams sat on the edge of his bed, still processing what he had experienced. The beauty of the music continued to echo in his mind, but so did questions about what he should do with this knowledge. As a priest, he understood the value of discretion, of keeping confidences, but as someone who deeply appreciated musical artistry, he also felt that such a gift shouldn't remain hidden. After much internal debate, Father Williams made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his phone and realized that he had actually been recording a voice memo for himself about his visit to the convent when the music had started. Without thinking, he had let the recording continue, and it had captured the last few minutes of Sister Margaret's performance. He listened to the recording, and even through the simple phone microphone, the beauty and skill of the playing came through clearly. The quality wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to demonstrate the remarkable talent he had witnessed. Father Williams spent the rest of the evening wrestling with what to do. By morning, he had made his decision. He needed to share this with someone, but he would do it carefully, respectfully, and with Sister Margaret's dignity in mind. His first call was to Mother Superior. He requested a private meeting and explained what he had witnessed. Mother Superior listened with growing amazement as Father Williams described Sister Margaret's performance and played the recording on his phone. Her reaction was a mixture of shock, admiration, and something that looked almost like regret. "I had no idea," Mother Superior said softly after hearing the recording. "In all these years, she never once mentioned that she could play like this. When she asked to perform at the benefactor gathering, I thought she meant simple songs, nothing like this." The recording was beautiful enough that Mother Superior agreed it should be shared further. But both she and Father Williams wanted to be thoughtful about how they proceeded. Father Williams had a friend in the diocesan communications office who also happened to be a classical music enthusiast. He thought this friend might appreciate the recording and perhaps know what to do with it. That friend turned out to be someone who understood the power of social media and the hunger people had for uplifting stories. Within hours of receiving the recording, he had shared it on the diocese's social media pages with a simple caption, "Hidden talent discovered at St. Catherine's Convent. Sometimes the most extraordinary gifts are found in the most humble places." The response was immediate and overwhelming. People began sharing the recording within minutes of its posting. Comments poured in from listeners who were moved to tears by the beautiful playing. Classical music enthusiasts recognized the high level of skill they were hearing. Local news stations began reaching out, wanting to know more about the mysterious pianist. But the real breakthrough came when the recording reached Linda Martinez, a music blogger who had connections throughout the classical music world. Linda had built a following by discovering and promoting underappreciated musical talent, and Sister Margaret's recording immediately caught her attention. Linda's blog post about the hidden virtuoso of St. Catherine's Convent was shared thousands of times within the first day. She wrote about the power of discovering extraordinary talent in unexpected places, about the beauty of music that comes from a life lived with depth and meaning, and about the questions the recording raised about how many other hidden artists might be living quiet lives among us. The story spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Music lovers, religious communities, and people who simply appreciated a good human interest story all began sharing Sister Margaret's recording. Within a week, it had been viewed and shared by hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Classical music magazines picked up the story. Radio stations began playing the recording during their programs. Television news shows started planning segments about the elderly nun whose extraordinary piano skills had captivated the internet. Reporters began calling the convent, asking for interviews with Sister Margaret. Through it all, Sister Margaret remained completely unaware of the storm of attention swirling around her. She continued her daily routine at the convent, teaching children, attending prayers, and helping with the various tasks that kept the community running. She had no idea that her private moment of musical expression had been recorded, much less that it was being heard by people around the world. The attention reached its peak when representatives from some of the world's most prestigious concert halls began reaching out to the convent. They had heard the recording and wanted to know if Sister Margaret would consider performing publicly. The most surprising invitation came from overseas. The London Symphony Orchestra had heard about the convent pianist and wanted to extend an invitation that would shock everyone, including Sister Margaret herself. But that revelation was still to come. For now, the world was discovering what Father Williams had stumbled upon that quiet afternoon. That extraordinary beauty can be found in the most unexpected places, and that some gifts are so powerful they cannot remain hidden forever, no matter how humbly their possessors try to live. Sister Margaret was in the convent garden tending to the tomato plants when Mother Superior approached her with an expression unlike any she had seen before. It was a mixture of excitement, bewilderment, and something that looked almost like apology. In her hands, Mother Superior carried a stack of letters and printouts that seemed to grow thicker by the day. "Sister Margaret," Mother Superior said gently, "we need to talk. There's something you need to know." The conversation that followed changed Sister Margaret's life forever. As Mother Superior explained about Father Williams's recording, about the social media posts, about the hundreds of thousands of people who had heard her playing, Sister Margaret's face went through a series of emotions. First shock, then embarrassment, then something that might have been wonder. "People heard me playing?" Sister Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just heard, Sister." They were moved to tears. "Look at this," Mother Superior said, showing her some of the comments that had poured in from around the world. "This woman from Australia says your music helped her through her mother's funeral. This man from Germany says he's never heard Chopin played with such soul. This young girl from Japan says you inspired her to keep practicing piano even when it gets difficult." As Sister Margaret read through the messages, her hands began to tremble. These weren't just polite compliments. These were people sharing how her music had touched their lives in real, meaningful ways. A cancer patient wrote that listening to her playing had brought peace during chemotherapy. A teacher said she played the recording for her music students to show them what true artistry sounded like. An elderly man wrote that it reminded him of his late wife, who had also been a pianist. But the real shock came when Mother Superior showed her the formal invitations that had been arriving. Concert. Halls from major cities around the world wanted her to perform. Music conservatories were asking if she would consider giving master classes. Recording companies were interested in producing an album. And then there was the letter that made both women sit down hard on the garden bench. It was written on official letterhead from the London Symphony Orchestra, one of the most prestigious orchestras in the world. The letter was respectful but direct. They had heard her recording. They were amazed by her talent, and they wanted to invite her to perform as a guest soloist with their orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. "The Royal Albert Hall," Sister Margaret repeated, staring at the letter. "But that's where the greatest musicians in the world perform." "Yes," Mother Superior said softly. "And they want you to be one of them." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of decisions and preparations. Sister Margaret had to grapple with questions she never thought she would face. Was it right for a nun to step into the spotlight like this? Would performing in concert halls take her away from her calling to serve God? How could she reconcile her vow of humility with the attention that would come with being a professional performer? Mother Superior, who had once firmly refused to let Sister Margaret play classical music at the benefactor gathering, now found herself advocating for the opposite position. "Perhaps," she said during one of their many conversations, "this is God's way of showing us that your musical gift was never meant to be hidden. Maybe your service to God can include sharing this beauty with the world." The decision to accept the London Symphony Orchestra's invitation wasn't made lightly. Sister Margaret spent many hours in prayer, seeking guidance about whether this was the right path. She consulted with other sisters, with Father Williams, and with religious advisors from the diocese. The consensus that emerged was surprising. Her musical gift could indeed be a form of ministry, a way of bringing beauty and peace to a world that desperately needed both. The preparation for London was intense. Sister Margaret hadn't performed publicly in over 4 decades, and while her technical skills were still exceptional, Performing with a full orchestra required a different kind of preparation. She worked with a local piano teacher to brush up on orchestral repertoire and to build her stamina for a full-length concert performance. The piece chosen for her debut was Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most beloved and challenging pieces in the piano repertoire. It was a piece she had learned as a young woman but had never performed with an orchestra. As she reacquainted herself with the music, Sister Margaret found new depths in the composition that her younger self had missed. The years of life experience, of joy and sorrow and quiet contemplation, had given her insights into the music that no amount of technical training could have provided. The media attention in the weeks leading up to the concert was unlike anything Sister Margaret could have imagined. News crews came to the convent to interview her. Newspapers ran feature stories about the nun who stunned the world. Television programs discussed her story during their arts and culture segments. Through it all, Sister Margaret remained gracious, but somewhat bewildered by the attention. "I'm just playing the piano," she would say to reporters. "I don't understand why everyone is so interested in that." But others understood what she couldn't see about herself. Her story represented something that resonated deeply with people around the world. In an age when many felt that opportunities were limited by age, background, or circumstances, Sister Margaret proved that extraordinary gifts could emerge at any time, from any place. Her humility and genuine surprise at the attention only made her more endearing to the public. The day of the concert arrived gray and drizzly, typical London weather that seemed to match Sister Margaret's nervous energy. She had arrived in London 3 days earlier for rehearsals with the orchestra, and each practice session had gone better than the last. The musicians, initially skeptical about performing with an unknown elderly nun, had quickly been won over by her musical sensitivity and her warmth as a person. As Sister Margaret stood in the wings of the Royal Albert Hall that evening, wearing a simple black dress that the convent had deemed appropriate for the occasion, she could hear the murmur of the crowd filing into their seats. 5,000 people had come to hear her play. The concert had sold out within hours of tickets going on sale, something that rarely happened even for well-known soloists. When she walked onto the stage and saw the sea of faces in the iconic circular hall, Sister Margaret felt a moment of pure terror. But then she sat down at the beautiful concert grand piano, placed her hands on the keys, and felt the familiar comfort that music had always brought her. The orchestra behind her was ready, the conductor raised his baton, and the music began. What happened next was nothing short of magical. From the opening notes of the concerto, it was clear that this was not just a performance but a deeply spiritual experience. Sister Margaret played with a combination of technical mastery and emotional depth that left the audience spellbound. Every phrase seemed to tell a story. Every passage carried the weight of a life fully lived. The second movement, with its famous beautiful melody, was particularly moving. Sister Margaret's playing was so tender, so filled with longing and hope, that there wasn't a dry eye in the hall. People later said that listening to her play that movement felt like being wrapped in musical prayer, like experiencing grace made audible. When the final notes of the concerto rang out, and the orchestra held their silence for that perfect moment, before applause erupted, something extraordinary happened. The entire audience rose to their feet as one, applauding not just with their hands but with their hearts. The ovation went on for nearly 10 minutes, with people shouting, "Bravo!" and wiping tears from their eyes. Sister Margaret, overwhelmed by the response, stood at the piano with tears streaming down her face. She had thought this moment might feel like a betrayal of her simple life at the convent, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. This was what her musical gift was meant for, not for her own glory, but for touching hearts and souls in ways that words never could. In the weeks that followed the London concert, Sister Margaret's life found a new balance. She returned to the convent and to her daily routine of prayer and service, but now she also traveled occasionally to give concerts and share her music with the world. She donated the proceeds from her performances to various charities, staying true to her vow of poverty while using her gift to help others. Most importantly, she began teaching piano again, working with young students at the local music school, and showing them that music was not just about technique, but about expressing the deepest parts of the human heart. She often told her students that they should never hide their gifts, that the world needed their unique voices and talents. Sister Margaret's story became a beacon of hope for people everywhere who felt their dreams had passed them by or their talents had been forgotten. She proved that it's never too late to share your gifts with the world, that extraordinary things can happen when we have the courage to be fully ourselves, and that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from hearts that have learned to wait patiently for their moment to sing.